Welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for staying with us. You're watching Plain Speak with me, Shivani Gupta. The G20 Summit has concluded and the presidency gavel has been handed over officially to Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Day 2 of the summit began with the G20 leaders gathering at Rajghat to pay tribute to Mahatma Gandhi. The leaders, along with PM Modi, laid ceremonial wreaths at the Gandhi Memorial and held a free plantation ceremony at Bharat Mandapam. After this, series of bilateral meetings were held with G20 nations where several things were discussed. The big takeaway of the summit, of course, was the call to end, quote, global trust deficit, the launch of the Global Biofuel Alliance and the launch of new connectivity networks between US, India, Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries. But the most complex part, of course, was the entire unanimity on geopolitical issues that was brought in via the joint declaration, which was clinched after over 200 hours of non-stop negotiations, 300 bilateral meetings and 15 drafts. The declaration noted with deep concern the immense human suffering and adverse impact of wars and conflicts around the world. China and Russia, whose heads of state skipped the summit, were also in agreement with the Delhi Declaration. But while the declaration called on all states to not use force to grab territory, it avoided condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine. India has managed to walk a real tightrope and do a fine balancing act. It is clear that most countries were invested in making sure that the Delhi summit is seen to be successful. It has also given an opportunity to India to showcase its civilizational messages, its growth and growing desire in shaping the future of the world. So what is that big key message from the G20 Leaders Summit 2023 or the multiple messages that have come through? We'll take that question forward to our experts joining us in just a bit. First, take a look at how the Delhi Leaders Summit was different from the G20 summits that have taken place in the past. We've already spoken about how there were 73 outcomes, 39 annexed documents and 112 presidency documents. So in that, it was the most productive. But apart from that, there was also the consensus reached on various issues on the first day, culminating in the joint declaration, which was seeming virtually impossible. The G20 summit also showcased India's impressive economic growth, the bold foreign policy and pragmatic approach that was highlighted by India's presidency also elevated India's status in the world. The G20 preparations also showcased India's ability to host significant global events. In fact, this was an event of an unprecedented scale, and the way the government managed to pull it off certainly is commendable. Now, Prime Minister Modi is also recognized as a trustworthy global leader after his initiatives, especially leading to the inclusion of the African Union in G20. Now, there were also plenty of bilaterals and each country emphasized the importance of India in different ways. First up, the takeaways from, for example, our bilateral with the United States of America. India's permanent seat at the UNSC was discussed yet again. Of course, there are broad ranges of cooperation between the two countries now. UK, an attempt to deepen trade linkages and boost investments. With Japan, cooperation in connectivity and commerce were discussed. There's Italy, of course, where trade, commerce, defense, technologies were all discussed. France, we've had great defense partnership and that cooperation was furthered in the meeting between the two premiers. Space sector development was also discussed. Then comes Canada. That meeting between the Prime Ministers took place today, and what has been confirmed now is that the Khalistani menace that has often been seen emanating out of Canada against India and the Indian government as well, this issue was raised with Justin Trudeau. The African Union, there was a bid to enhance cooperation in shipping, trade. Turkey, another key partner, trade and infrastructure linkages were discussed. Mauritius, there was cooperation in infrastructure, fintech and culture, all discussed. There's also Bangladesh, of course, and don't need to add too much about India-Bangladesh ties, but connectivity and commercial linkages were discussed here as well. Now, the Chinese President Xi Jinping's decision to stay away may have been intended to deny India its moment when it was hosting the G20 leaders plus more. Instead, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with the US and the European countries, figured out a way to make sure that they effectively counter China on the world stage. So take a look at how this one's done, and of course a lot needs to be read between the lines as well when it comes to diplomacy. So Xi's absence from the G20 actually backfired because it only underscored China's losing prominence. China was also isolated on key issues such as the joint communique on the Russia-Ukraine war. US and India engaged with other nations and strengthened their collective stance, which also further sidelined China's role in shaping outcomes. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Now, this is a very key development taking place on the sidelines of the G20, because this is also seen as a counter to the China's Belt and Road Initiative. And remember, Italy is all set to leave the BRI now. Criticism of the IMEC by Chinese media also indicated China's discomfort by such initiatives in the region. Despite questions over multilateralism, this summit was a successful one and actually quite dynamic, where countries finally managed to even agree on some of the sticking points. And that further illustrates China's limited role in shaping some of these global outcomes and agendas. And the issues raised by China, for example, earlier they had a problem with the fact that we used the Sanskrit phrase Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam as the motto of this G20, or the USA's bid to host the G20 gathering in 2026. These are all being seen as attempts to thwart other countries' progress or deny them their time in the light. Basically, it comes across a little bit like a crybaby. But the big issue that we will take forward with our experts joining us on Plain Speak today is exactly what would be the big key message, not just from the perspective of India, but also as far as the global community is concerned, that has gone out to the world and to all of its big powers from this G20 summit. And possibly there isn't one, but there are many, and we'll take that forward in just a bit.
G20 समिट के समापन की घोषणा करता हूं। वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर का रोड मैप सुखद हो।
India did its utmost for its presidency of the G20 to serve unity and peace and send across a message of unity.
G20 is a G20 that is exceptionally very well organized.
Let's go across to the guests joining us. Gurjeet Singh is former ambassador of India to countries like Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN countries and the African Union. Ali Vain is senior analyst at Eurasia Group. Ben Aris, editor-in-chief, BNE and former Moscow bureau chief, Daily Telegraph is joining us. Also, Vilena Chakarova, geopolitical strategist, is also with us. A big thanks to all of you for making time. Vilena, why don't I start with you? What do you see in a world that is being likened to a fractured world, a divided world with a literal war going on in Europe? What do you see as the biggest key message emanating from this G20 summit?
Thank you very much for the invitation, first and foremost. I argue that this particular summit in India, the G20 summit in India, has had the following key geopolitical milestones that more or less were not really anticipated in the scale and scope that they have taken place. First and foremost, joint declaration, obviously a very, very big success for Indian diplomacy. And I've been witnessing the whole process during the different summits of the ministers of the G20 countries. It was a very, very big milestone. The second important point is that next to the European Union, African Union is going to be an institutional player representing 55 countries. This is a big, actually big breakthrough specifically for India, as India wants to speak for the global south. And third important point, absolutely unexpected, I must say, and a big geoeconomic breakthrough is in fact the announcement of the India Gulf region Europe corridor, which is obviously an antidote of China's BRI.
You say that was unexpected completely, but was it? It's been discussed and possibly, in hushed tones, in murmurs for quite some time. But are you surprised that it has actually been agreed upon, although it's just a memorandum right now?
Do you mean the memorandum of understanding regarding the corridor, or do you mean the joint declaration?
For the corridor.
Of course, the corridor has been in various talks between, on the one hand, Indian and Indian representatives and representatives from the Gulf region. And as we've known, actually, India, Israel, and the Gulf region have had very, very significant diplomatic talks, specifically when it comes to trade relationship. On the other hand, of course, India, Europe has witnessed a very, very big success in terms of the relaunch of the FTA, of the free trade agreement. So in a sense, there have been a lot of talks, and I have been to Greece when Prime Minister Modi was visiting the country and was in conversations with Prime Minister Mitsotakis. So right now we understand also that certainly the role of the Port Piraeus has been part of the conversations, because this will be one of the key ports that will connect India, Gulf region with Europe.
And, since you touched that point, let me also ask you about Italy's move to potentially leave the BRI. And we are being told, at least via some news portals, is that communication has happened on the sidelines of the G20 by Ms. Maloney. So do you see a shift happening in how the world is viewing a partnership with India versus a partnership with China?
Absolutely. I've been also to India at the Raisina dialogue when Prime Minister Modi actually hosted PM Meloni.
Yes.
She was the inauguration guest, and this relationship took off from there, and we see already the first fruits with the decision of Italy. I think that it is very much due to this personal relationship between the two prime ministers that now Italy is considering to exit China's BRI. By the way, Italy has been the only G7 country that actually has signed a memorandum of understanding with China to be part of the BRI. So this is a critical, I think, milestone in the not only bilateral relationship with India, but also when it comes to this big competition right now between United States and China.
Yes.
In terms of connectivity, in terms of trade, infrastructure, corridors, connectivity, because right now India has also its own, let's say, idea and vision about alternative corridors. And this, of course, should be one way how to prevent another, let's say, Cold War 2.0 or bipolarity from happening between United States and China.
Yes, and of course India has its own concerns vis-a-vis China too. But before I go further on the issue of China, Ben Arias, I want to understand from you how Russia is looking at the joint declaration. This was seemingly impossible, but a language was agreed upon and it was indeed adopted. There is no specific mention of Russia, but the language is still talking about the same universal principles that many countries have highlighted in the past, including India. What's the Russian sense on the joint declaration, particularly on the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think Russia, the Kremlin, was very happy with it, in so much as you say, the watered-down language of the declaration was extremely weak, and it was like the lightest rebuke that possibly could come, in so much as the declaration talked about, quote-unquote, all states, didn't mention Russia by name at all. And it talked about the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian foreign ministry protested and said it should have been the war against Ukraine. And so for Russia, I mean, it was expecting some sort of condemnation from the G20 participants, but it got off extremely lightly. And so the Kremlin, I think, has been very happy with that. It's a result of, the weak language highlights the divisions within the G20, within the BRICS Plus, the expanded emerging markets club. That some people, like the Chinese and the Russians, they wanted to see it as a political tool in order to confront the West, whereas other members, more dovish members like South Africa and India, they want to see these bodies, the G20 plus the new BRICS Plus, more as cooperative lobbying groups where the emerging markets, Global South, can make themselves heard, but they don't want to go into conflict. And so for Modi, getting the declaration through, getting a condemnation through at all, in that very diversified set of views, was a huge diplomatic coup. But at the end of the day, it could have been stronger. And as I say, the Ukrainian foreign minister, they complained bitterly and said it didn't go nearly far enough.
Just in continuation to that, a lot of the countries that were, of course, part of the G20, in their individual communications and their briefings to the media, they did use much harsher words on the war in Ukraine by Russia, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as they would like to call it. So the fact that they were still there, they hold very close their views on the position of Russia and Ukraine. Do you still see as this being a positive development, that at least in a multilateral forum like the G20, the Russia-Ukraine conflict didn't completely hijack everything else and a declaration was possible?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you've got two things going on here. One is that the Global South, like the African Union's just joined with the G20. That brings them to the top table with a voice in geopolitics, international geopolitics. And as responsible members of the global community that actually want to say in how the world is run, then they all need to have a position on this war if they're going to comment on international politics. But on the other side, they see, I think most of the Global South see this as a European fight between Russia and Europe and Ukraine, and really nothing to do with them. And they would rather sit on the fence and not get sucked into it, not get involved, not supply arms, but continue to do trade and get investment and develop. And so this leads to them sort of offering a rather weak statement. I don't think anybody's going to do anything. I mean, none of those Global South countries have joined in sanctions. They're just ignoring them. And so, you know, it's difficult. It's a difficult balance that they're trying to strike. We had Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa in Kiev, who was offering a peace plan. I think this is the first time we've seen an African president in Europe offering peace plans for a European or international problem. So they're beginning to get involved, but his peace plan was, you know, it was a bit of a how shall I say, bodged job. It was dismissed out of hand. So they're very new at this and they're not very good at it. And really, no one's really paying that much attention. But the point being is that they're all in play now and they have to have positions on these things. Right. And that was what the declaration was.
I will come back to our guests on where this conflict is going and whether this declaration could also pave way for a talk maybe between the West and NATO and Russia, something that a lot of experts have been saying that should happen because dialogue's the only way forward. But before that, let me also bring in Gurjeet Singh, former ambassador of India. Gurjeet Singh, what do you feel is the highlight, particularly from the point of view of India's interest from the G20 summit?
Thank you. So first I would like to comment on what others are saying about the Ukraine paragraphs. So I think it was a very nuanced diplomacy by India, because by not naming Russia but exercising all the other important principles of the UN Charter, India has also drawn attention to the aggression of China on its neighbors. So therefore, this is the double-edged sword. We were not wanting to condemn Russia, but we want to make sure that China is also warned that it is transgressing the international rules-based order. Now, to answer your question, what are, according to me, are the best takeaways? I think the empathy and courage which Indian diplomacy showed is amazing. We have become a huge consensus builder. We are championing the Global South, and by the end of it, I think we were the main interlocutor between the Global South and the G7. And I think that is where the relationship with Prime Minister Meloni is extremely important, because she is the next chair of the G7. I think this dynamics is something we have to see. India speaking up for the Global South, engaging with the G7, letting China and Russia be where they want to be, and trying to get the world on a better place.
And speaking of the legacy that India is leaving, Gurjeet Singh, as far as getting in the African Union is concerned, a lot of our viewers would like to know, certainly from your experience, what is the tangible benefit that India gets by doing this? Of course, it's good to play that role of wanting more inclusion of the Global South, something that India has been championing. But what are the tangible benefits for us?
As a former ambassador to the African Union, I am extremely happy that this has happened. So somebody asked me, why did it happen now? It happened now because India is the chair. No other chair ever heard Africa. Everybody talks at them, not to them. India listens to Africa and the global south, and Africa asked us, can you please get us a permanent membership of the G20? Because the permanent membership of the UN Security Council is very far away. India has always spoken up for Africa, whether at Bandung or in the non-aligned movement, but this was the biggest stage at which India could help Africa to come. So what Africa gains is a place at the high table.
Yes.
They can talk as equals to everybody, but for India, we show our age-old constructive, what I call the Harambe factor with Africa, and this is a sign of our continuing partnership with Africa. We are not looking for tangible gains or deals. We are looking for balancing the interests of the global south and the developed countries in the G20, and what better than bringing in the largest regional organization, the African Union.
Okay. Ali, I'm coming to you now. The first question is the same. What, according to you, is the big headline from the G20 summit?
The big headline is that India, with this G20 summit, has emerged as a serious global convener. India is no longer just a convener or a significant player in the Indo-Pacific. It's a global diplomatic convener, and bringing together, because remember, what does the G20 represent? The G20 brings together advanced industrial democracies. It brings together members of the developing world, and India is now saying to both, we can bring you together. We can speak to advanced industrial democracies. We can champion the global south. And I think the fact that India was able to get a communique through, contrary to the expectations of many observers, is a significant diplomatic coup. And I think that this G20 summit is really, not only with the joint statement, but with the number of deliverables that the G20 produced, I think is really going to elevate India's diplomatic stature in the Indo-Pacific, but globally going forward. It's a major diplomatic coup for India.
Some experts are pointing out that if there was no joint communique from this G20 summit, in the climate that we live in, with questions already being raised on multilateralism, it could have been another death knell as far as multilateral fora are concerned. So do you think in that sense, it actually saved multilateralism from, it seems to be out of vogue, but could possibly come back into fashion?
It definitely saved the G20 from what could have been, I think, a concerning outcome, because, as you said, a lot of observers didn't think that a joint statement would be reached because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So, one, the fact that the summit produced a statement is significant, and I think that there's also a renewed interest in the G20 now, and I think that you mentioned this in your opening remarks. You saw the energy that not only that India brought, but the other countries who attended. There was a lot of energy at the summit. It produced a lot of deliverables, and I think that there's a real sense that the G20 perhaps had been hanging on the precipice, and some observers have been questioning its relevance. But I think that with this summit, the G20, it hasn't overcome geopolitical frictions, but it has established that it matters, it will continue to matter. And so I think that going forward, what we will see is between the G7, the G20, and the emerging BRICS grouping, or the expanded BRICS grouping rather, I think that we'll see that those three organizations are going to increasingly shape the global agenda going forward.
Okay. Velina, you want to weigh in on this? The future of multilateralism, the future of G20, or should I say G21 now? How is this group going to be able to tackle with the increasing challenges that the world is witnessing?
Well, first, let's not forget that G20 became this very, let's say, quite relevant bloc or group of states because of crises. So, first summit actually took place following the great financial crisis, and since then, this was in fact the summit dealing with the repercussions from big crises. Right now, we have plenty of them, namely socioeconomic repercussions from the pandemic, the socioeconomic repercussions from Russia's war against Ukraine. In fact, this was entailed in the joint declaration. I think it was very important, even though that the perpetrator was not named, that this joint declaration addressed the big, in fact, I would say, sorrow and worries when it comes to the G20 countries, and also when it comes to global south, and that is the potential for global food crisis 2.0, potential for global energy crisis 2.0, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, G7 is no longer the format, I argue, that can represent the interests and can cope and deal with these repercussions, because the most developed economies have very, very different agenda. I think that among all the multilaterals, given also the rise of formats such as BRIC and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because of the obviously bigger geopolitical importance of China in the world, India will be eager to steer the process within the Global South, which is why G20 will be one of these relevant formats that will, let's say, be the playground for Indian diplomacy and Indian interests. Here, for instance, it is not actually coincidental that this format between the BRICS countries that were represented, that means without China and Russia, the rest of them had also a meeting with the United States, and we know for a fact that Brazil will be hosting the next G20 summit. So obviously this has been an effort to coordinate some kind of agenda for the next summit.
Okay.
I think final remark on my side, the whole digital, transition, the energy transition, the climate related topics, the regional actually integration, what was, I think, a very, very big topic throughout the whole summit, namely that there are still countries that want to capitalize on globalization with different means. So that means globalization still has to be on the agenda, but obviously in a different way. And I think that India is going to steer this process of, regional integration, globalization with other means and, other characteristics, contrary to what China or, let's say, United States have been propagating as globalization for, let's say, the last decade.
All right, I want to go quickly back to Ali one more time on the issue of the global message from India. And one of India's big interests is, of course, to tell the world to differentiate between a benevolent power in Asia versus an expansionist power in Asia. They may not do so in as many words versus China, because, of course, China is a partner for India. We look forward to better relationships with the country. But do you think, one, India has been able to send that message to global powers, and barring their own, apart from their own concerns, for example, US has a concern with China, and we are seeing increasing US relationship with India. So I don't want to give all credit to the fact that it's just because of India. I think it's also because of geopolitical realities. But aside from their own concerns, do you think global powers now understand that India is a better power than, let's say, some else?
India has done itself a lot of favors with this summit. And so I think that for many powers around the world, whether it's the United States, whether it's the European Union, a growing number of powers are saying, look, India has demonstrated that it can bring together advanced industrial democracies and champion the global South. And also, India, by a number of metrics, its trajectory going forward is more favorable than China's. India is projected to grow faster this year and next year than China. India has a much more favorable demographic outlook than China has. And I think that India also has a significant ideological alignment with a number of other powerful countries in the world. So I think that going forward, I don't want to diminish the challenges that India confronts internally, and I don't want to suggest that just because of this G20 summit that India's diplomacy won't have any challenges. But India has taken a major step with this summit, and I think that its relationships with major powers around the world will continue to deepen. This was a big diplomatic coup for Delhi. Okay.
Ben, coming to you on the issue of how the world is worried about a so-called Russia-China tango. There are concerns that the West, maybe to be blamed for it partly, but is pushing Russia too close to China. And there are concerns if it becomes a vassal of China. Do you believe that there is some recalibration that could come in both from the West and from Russia of some of the differences that have become elongated because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that there could be some, some shortening of that divide, that schism? And in context of the joint communique, where Russia wasn't named directly, do you see any possibility of a greater chance of a talk between the West and Russia?
So, a couple of thoughts. I think that, unfortunately...
Sorry, Ali, I'm really sorry for that. This was for Ben Harris. My apologies.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies.
So, yes, I agree. I mean, Russia has been pushed into the arms of China, and it never really wanted to go there. I interviewed the first Deputy Prime Minister, who told me that Russia's future is with Europe. And Putin has always wanted to ally and become part of the European Union, or at least be very close partner with it. And because of the showdown, it's turned to China as the obvious alternative, but that's not really a very comfortable relationship. China and Russia have actually never got on that well. And even in the Soviet era, that the People's Republic and the Soviet Union were never allies when they should have been, both as communist nations. However, things have developed rapidly, and to some extent, Russia is a vassal of China, but then China is seeing Russia more as an ally because now it's scooping up all these other emerging markets and it wants to build some sort of confederation. And so we've gone from Russia-China as a relationship to this expanded BRICS format, where Brazil's been brought in, India's been brought in, South Africa as well. And that's a function of the emerging markets in general, Global South as well. After 30 years since the end of the socialist experiment, a lot of these markets are now emerged and they're starting to feel like flex their political muscles. They're like, we're not represented at all these international organizations and we need to be. And this whole process is being catalyzed by the war in Ukraine, in so much as that the West has exercised its huge power for the first time. I mean, it's weaponized the dollar, it's weaponized trade. And I think that's unsettled everybody who's not at top table, who's not in the inner circle of the G7, because they're afraid, well, that could happen to us if the West decides that they don't like whatever policy it is that we're doing. And specifically in China, it's already in the crosshairs, which has pushed it together with Russia. And in that sense, they have to be allies against the US, not, making Russia completely subservient. But then you've got someone like India who's not in those crosshairs and doesn't expect to be. And their view on it is to be much more cooperative, to represent the Global South at the international top table, but in a cooperative way. So you've just seen this transport corridor appear, which is going to boost trade.
Yes.
And that's another very interesting aspect, because in this new Global South emerging G20, G21 group, there's a rivalry between the basic view of what the emerging markets or Global South should be doing. And there's a rivalry there between India and China. And this summit was very significant because although you could argue this new group has become political since the BRICS summit just 2 weeks ago, suddenly at the G20 summit, you could even argue that India is actually taking control and that its more dovish cooperative view is coming to the fore, and that India might be rivaling China. I think it definitely is rivaling China for the lead in this whole new Global South bloc that's forming a top table, and that pushed in this summit pushed China to one side.
Well, certainly we'll have to do a lot more when it comes to that, and the economic aspect of it cannot be sidelined. The reason why India can do so today is because its economy is the bright spot on the global landscape. Gurjeet Singh, coming to you for our final comments as well. What is it that India needs to do to maintain this momentum and to continue to grow strength to strength from what it has gained from the G20 summit?
Well, the position that India has acquired for itself, which all the panelists have articulated well, India needs to exercise that power responsibly. We also need to make sure that other G20 members, whether from the G7 or China, act more responsibly too. For instance, the reform of the multilateral development banks also means reform of the BRI. We want climate finance to be real, not promises. We want globalization to be real. We don't want unilateral sanctions to come and disrupt everybody's life for geostrategic reasons. Therefore, the commonality that we have built up for the good of mankind, this is what we want everybody to subscribe to in reality and not just as a consensus document at the G20. To me, that is the biggest aspiration.
A diplomat from India who served in so many countries, the one big difference that India is displaying is that while it is a constructive force that has the ability to bring everyone together even on complex issues, it is also standing steadfast when it comes to its own national interests. We've seen that with China, we've seen that in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the global world is beginning to understand that just like them, India is going to keep its national interest foremost, and there is no pressurizing India to change that, at least now.
Very true. For instance, we talked about the Ukraine paragraphs, but actually the Ukraine paragraphs are India's position from the beginning.
Yes.
We have not changed that position. We just brought it and now it is accepted by everybody. So in the beginning, everybody criticized us. Then they grudgingly accepted it. And today they are lauding you as a consensus document. The position is the same. The same goes for the biofuel alliance. India has already pushed the International Solar Alliance. So India is acting responsibly where climate is concerned, knowing its responsibilities and the requirements of fulfilling the INDCs. But Biofuels Alliance is good. This will provide you energy security to many countries which are oil dependent by using their biomass. So there are many initiatives like this. The SDGs are extremely important to the global south. This year you will hear at the SDG summit how far behind the world has fallen. We need to do things to improve the lot of the globe. See, foreign policy is not simply talking to states. Foreign policy is, can I make the life of my people better? And that is what we must pursue.
And that is really the region in which India has emerged as a great voice, because it has consistently been talking about global good. And the message of one world, one future, one family was precisely that of its presidency. Gurjeet Singh will stay with us. I do thank our other experts for joining us. Many thanks for your time again.